The darkness of the night carried a distinct stillness. Empty streets, flickering streetlights reflecting off the small puddles left behind by a light drizzle. The city remained awake but moved at a slower rhythm, as if everything was unwinding after the chaos of the day. Johnny walked along the stone-paved sidewalk, his worn leather shoes producing a steady, muted clatter with each step. He wasn't in a hurry, nor did he have a specific destination. He simply wanted to walk, to clear his mind after a long day. A gentle breeze swept through, carrying the scent of damp leaves and the faint chill of the night. Johnny pulled up the collar of his coat and stopped in front of a small café tucked away by the roadside. Soft golden light spilled from inside, casting a warm glow on the weathered wooden sign hanging above the glass door. Though the hand-painted letters had faded over time, they were still legible. Blackbird Cafe. Johnny let out a faint chuckle as he thought about how long it had been since he last came here. In his younger days, when his career was just a distant dream, he had spent countless hours in this cafe. A black coffee, a small notebook, and endless musings about the future. Back then, he had nothing but ambition. Now, everything was different. He pushed the door open. The interior had hardly changed. Dark wooden walls, the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee mixed with the scent of freshly baked pastries. The soft yellow lights illuminated the small tables, creating an oddly comforting warmth. There were only a handful of customers, each lost in their own world. A book, a laptop screen, or simply the cup of coffee in front of them. Johnny walked straight to the counter and ordered a black coffee. The barista didn't seem to recognize him, or if they did, they didn't show it. That was a relief. He chose a seat near the corner, a spot where he could observe the entire cafe without drawing attention. An old habit. When his coffee arrived, Johnny took a slow sip. The bitter taste spread across his tongue, familiar yet distant, like something from another lifetime. Then his gaze landed on a woman. She sat alone at a table by the window, her posture tense. Her hands clutched the ceramic cup before her, yet she didn't drink. Her hair was slightly disheveled, the shoulders of her coat worn thin, and exhaustion was etched onto her face. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Johnny's attention. It was her eyes. Eyes that were fixed on something beyond the glass, searching the darkness. Or rather, someone. Johnny frowned as he wondered whether she was waiting for someone or hiding from them. He tried not to dwell on it, but instinct told him something was very wrong. When the server returned to her table, Johnny overheard the woman's soft but trembling voice as she asked if she could stay there as long as she needed, explaining that she couldn't go home that night. The server hesitated but eventually nodded. Johnny set his coffee down, quietly watching. He wondered what she was so afraid of that she couldn't go home. Outside the window, a figure appeared. A man. He stood directly across from the cafe, not stepping inside but not leaving either. His gaze was locked onto the interior, as if searching for someone. No signs of impatience, no rushed movements, just a cold, unwavering stare. Johnny didn't need to guess who he was looking at. The woman shuddered, glanced toward the window, then quickly lowered her head, as if fearing that even a second of eye contact would alert him to her presence. Johnny took a deep breath. He had seen that look before. Not the look of someone who had casually spotted an acquaintance. Not the look of someone waiting for a friend. It was the look of a predator, and his prey was sitting right in front of Johnny. Johnny wasn't the kind of man who interfered in others' business, but sometimes instinct refused to let him walk away. He set down his cup, stood up, and slowly approached the woman's table. She flinched as he drew closer. Her eyes widened, not in surprise, but in fear. Johnny didn't speak right away. He pulled out a chair across from her and kept his voice as calm and gentle as possible, asking if she was all right. She didn't answer immediately. Her fingers tightened around the rim of her cup, her gaze darting away, as if unsure whether she could trust the man sitting before her. Johnny didn't rush her. He simply waited. Finally, she shook her head. A single tear slid down the back of her hand as she whispered, barely above a breath, that she couldn't leave because he was waiting outside. Her voice was strained, as if the words themselves hurt to say. Johnny didn't turn to look right away, but he already knew. The man was still there, waiting, patient, like a predator. Johnny looked at the girl, then glanced outside again. He told her, his voice calm yet firm, that if she wanted to leave, he could help. The girl stared at him as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. For the first time in a long while, someone had reached out to help her. Johnny observed the girl in front of him. Her face was pale, her eyes still tinged with doubt. Her hands clutched the coffee cup tightly, as if it were her only anchor at that moment. He didn't know what had compelled him to step forward, but perhaps it was an instinct beyond his control. He wasn't the kind of person who meddled in others' affairs, but he also couldn't pretend he hadn't seen anything. The girl's eyes said it all, a silent desperation struggling to stay hidden. She didn't answer right away. A light breeze slipped through the gap in the door, making the thin curtains by the window sway. A prolonged silence stretched between them. Finally, she shook her head slightly. A tear fell, rolling softly down the back of her hand, and she spoke in a trembling voice, saying that she couldn't leave because he was waiting outside. Her simple statement carried a heavy weight. Johnny didn't need to ask who he was. He had already seen the man standing across from the cafe, his eyes unwavering, like a predator who had locked onto its prey. Johnny didn't turn to look right away. He didn't want to appear alarmed or make the girl more frightened. He simply asked her softly if she wanted to leave. The girl looked at him, something flickering in her eyes, a faint glimmer of hope, as if even she couldn't believe that someone was willing to help her. She then asked if he could really help. Johnny nodded, his voice steady, and repeated that if she wanted to leave, he could help. She hesitated, but after a few seconds, she gave a small nod. A decision, a moment that could change everything. Johnny pulled some money from his pocket, placed it on the table, and stood up first. The girl was still hesitant, but when she saw him moving toward the door, she quickly followed. The moment they stepped outside, the atmosphere shifted. The man was still there. When he saw Johnny and the girl leaving the cafe, he smirked, his gaze filled with challenge. Johnny didn't stop. He simply reached for the girl's wrist, gently but firmly, and led her into the narrow street beside the cafe. It only took a second, but the sound of footsteps followed immediately. He was right behind them. Johnny could feel the girl's quick, shallow breaths. She was shaking so badly that her hands trembled as she clung to his coat. In a whisper, her voice trembling, she urged him to hurry, saying that they had to go. Johnny didn't need to hear more. He quickened his pace, pulling her into an alley. The footsteps behind them picked up speed as well. The man was no longer hiding his pursuit. He wanted them to know he was still there, following their every step. The cold night air mixed with the sound of their hurried breathing. Dim streetlights flickered overhead, the old buildings on either side of the alley, making the atmosphere feel even heavier. Johnny knew they couldn't keep running forever. He stopped, pulling the girl into a shadowed corner. She gasped for breath, her eyes filled with panic. Johnny, his voice low but firm, told her that they couldn't keep running like this. The girl looked at him. Something caught in her throat. After a pause, she finally admitted, her voice cracking, that the man was not just following her. He wanted to kill her. A chill ran down Johnny's spine. He hadn't expected that answer. She looked at him, her fear now completely stripped away. Only desperation remained. She added that he had killed before. Johnny took a deep breath. He needed to understand exactly what was happening. He told her that she needed to tell him everything, asking who the man was and what was going on. The girl trembled before finally revealing, barely above a whisper, that her name was Lily and that the man used to be her boyfriend. Lily shook her head as if trying to shake off the terrifying memories. She confessed that she had once trusted him, but later discovered a secret she was never supposed to know. She looked at Johnny, her eyes red-rimmed, and said that he had killed someone and now intended to kill her to keep her quiet. A sharp gust of cold wind rushed through the alley. Johnny looked at Lily, then glanced toward the dark street behind them. The man was still there. He stood at the entrance of the alley, neither stepping forward nor leaving. His gaze was like that of a wild animal, calculating its move before striking. No hurry, no impatience, because he knew they had nowhere to run. Johnny tightened his grip on Lily's hand, keeping his voice steady as he asked if she trusted him. Lily looked at him, still uncertain, and asked why. Johnny met her gaze and told her that if she trusted him, she needed to listen to him because he wouldn't let her die. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly nodded. Even if just for a second, Johnny knew. She had decided to place her life in his hands. Footsteps echoed in the alley. The man was approaching. Johnny stepped in front of Lily, his stance unwavering. The man stopped, observing them for a long moment. Then he smirked and taunted Johnny, questioning whether he really thought he could take her from him. Johnny didn't respond. He simply stared at the man, his gaze cold and unwavering. He stated with a steady voice, calm but carrying a terrifying certainty, that Lily didn't belong to anyone. The man scoffed and slipped his hand into his coat pocket. Lily held her breath. Then Johnny saw it, a glint of steel in the dim alley light, a small, sharp knife. He could feel Lily trembling beside him. Johnny squeezed her hand lightly, offering a silent reassurance. The man stepped forward. One more step, and everything would change. Johnny knew that if there was ever a moment to act, it was now. The alley was swallowed in darkness, the cold air sending a shiver through Lily. But Johnny realized, it wasn't just the weather. The man before them had stopped smiling. He gripped the knife tighter, the steel blade catching the faint light from the distant street lamp. Lily's words echoed in Johnny's mind as he recalled her saying that the man had killed before. A murderer, a man with nothing to lose. Johnny wasn't afraid, but he knew that words wouldn't solve this. The man took a step closer. Lily instinctively moved back, but Johnny stood firm, his gaze unshaken. The man spoke in a low, almost patient voice, as if explaining something obvious. He reminded Lily that he had warned her. She shouldn't have run, she shouldn't have told anyone, but she didn't listen. He emphasized each word, slow and deliberate, lacing them with a quiet threat. Johnny tightened his grip on Lily's hand and warned her in a low but firm voice that the man had a weapon and that she should run when she got the chance. She looked at him, hesitating, but she didn't have time to react. The man lunged. Johnny sidestepped just as the blade slashed downward. He was fast, but Johnny was faster. Spinning, he pulled Lily behind him while driving his foot into the man's stomach. The attacker stumbled back a few steps but didn't fall. Johnny observed him carefully, his breathing steady. This wasn't just some street thug. The man didn't panic. He didn't flinch. Instead, he smirked and wiped a trickle of blood from his lip before commenting that Johnny wasn't an idiot. Johnny didn't reply. He just kept his eyes locked on the man. One mistake. That was all it would take. The man adjusted his grip on the knife, his gaze flicking toward Lily. Johnny saw it instantly. He wasn't aiming for him. He was aiming for her. Johnny clenched his fists. The man lunged again, this time not at Johnny, straight for Lily. But he never reached her, because Johnny was already there. Before the blade could rise, Johnny's fist smashed into the man's jaw. The impact echoed through the empty alley. The attacker staggered for a second, but recovered quickly. Johnny knew this wasn't a simple street fight. This was a fight to survive. The murderer smirked, stepping back slightly before flipping the knife to his other hand. He muttered that Johnny was good, but had no idea who he was up against. Johnny didn't react. Lily was trembling behind him, gripping the brick wall, her eyes filled with terror. Johnny glanced at her. A mistake. The man moved instantly. The knife cut through the air, aimed for Johnny's side. But he dodged. Catching the attacker's wrist, Johnny twisted sharply. The knife dropped to the ground with a cold metallic clink, but the man didn't stop. He spun, driving his elbow into Johnny's ribs. Johnny staggered slightly but didn't fall. The murderer exhaled sharply, realizing Johnny wasn't an easy target. But he wasn't done. Dropping low, he reached for the knife. This time, he didn't attack right away. He grinned and stated that it was fine, but then he questioned whether Johnny really thought the police would get there in time. Johnny frowned slightly. Lily tensed. He wasn't afraid of the police. He had planned for this. Reaching into his pocket, the man pulled out a phone and tapped out a quick message. Then he looked up, his grin widening as he told Johnny that they weren't alone. Footsteps echoed at the end of the alley. More than one. Johnny's fists clenched. He had thought he was dealing with one madman. He was wrong. This wasn't just a murderer. He had backup. And now, they were here. The sound of footsteps grew louder. Not just one. Johnny knew immediately. They were in far more danger than he had thought. The man in front of them was still grinning. the knife in his hand gleaming under the flickering streetlight. He wasn't worried about losing. If anything, he looked amused, because now he wasn't alone. Johnny turned his head slightly, just enough to see three figures moving closer. Their steps were slow, deliberate. They weren't hiding their intentions. Lily gripped Johnny's arm, her breath unsteady, and in a barely audible voice, she asked him what they should do. Johnny didn't answer immediately. He knew there were only two choices, fight or run. But where could they run? They were trapped. The murderer let out a loud, mocking laugh, taunting Johnny by questioning whether he really thought he could take Lily away from him. He shook his head as if speaking to a fool, before adding that Johnny had no idea who he was dealing with. Johnny didn't respond. He slowly moved Lily behind him, keeping her at the safest distance possible. The murderer noticed Johnny's protective stance and sneered before stating that if Johnny wanted to protect her, then he would take Johnny first. Without hesitation, he lunged. Johnny sidestepped, delivering a sharp punch straight to the man's jaw. The murderer staggered but didn't fall. His two accomplices, standing behind him, quickly sprang into action. Johnny took a step back, positioning himself to shield Lily. He told her in a sharp and firm voice to run. Lily hesitated and asked about him, but Johnny didn't let her finish. He simply repeated his command, urging her to run. Clenching her fists, she turned and sprinted toward the end of the alley. Johnny didn't look after her. He didn't have the time. The murderer charged again, faster, more aggressive this time. Johnny blocked the first strike and dodged the second. But the murderer wasn't alone. His accomplices had arrived. One of them pulled a metal rod from his coat and swung it. Johnny couldn't dodge completely. The rod scraped against his arm, tearing his jacket and leaving a sharp sting. But he didn't stop. Grabbing the attacker's collar, Johnny used his strength to slam him hard against the wall. The second accomplice aimed a kick at him, but Johnny stepped back just in time. The murderer let out a low chuckle, acknowledging that Johnny wasn't bad, but he was alone. Johnny didn't answer. He adjusted his breathing. 3 against 1. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't going down easily. The man with the knife lunged again. Johnny twisted his body, grabbing the attacker's wrist and wrenching it sharply. A sickening crack echoed through the alley. The knife clattered to the ground. Johnny didn't hesitate. He drove a punch into the murderer's stomach, making him collapse to his knees. But before Johnny could react, another blow struck him hard from behind. Johnny stumbled, but he didn't fall. Turning, he faced the remaining two. The murderer clutched his injured wrist, his eyes burning with rage, before growling that Johnny was going to regret this. Then he lunged again. Johnny had no choice. With one final decisive punch, he knocked the murderer to the ground. The two accomplices exchanged looks, realizing they had underestimated Johnny. One of them hesitated, then turned and ran. The last one wavered for a moment, then followed. Only Johnny and the murderer remained. The man lay on the ground, his breath ragged. From a distance, Lily ran back, her eyes filled with worry. She asked Johnny if he was okay. Johnny nodded, though his body ached all over. He turned to look at the murderer, now curled up, barely able to move. A faint sound in the distance. Police sirens. Johnny didn't need to do anything else. They had lost. Lily trembled, tears spilling over as she whispered her gratitude to Johnny. Johnny looked at her and gave a small smile, assuring her that it was over. The police arrived, pinning the murderer down in cuffs. An officer approached Johnny and asked him to explain what had happened. Johnny exhaled, glancing at Lily's face, still scared, but now filled with gratitude. He spoke slowly, simply stating that he had just been in the right place at the right time. The alley fell into silence as the police secured the scene. Flashing lights, rushing footsteps, and the weight of the moment still lingered, but Johnny was no longer paying attention. It was over. He looked at Lily, the small woman who had endured so much. Her hands were still clenched in the fabric of her jacket, but she no longer trembled. She was no longer prey. She was free. A police officer approached Johnny again, his expression unreadable, and repeated his request for Johnny to explain what had happened. Johnny let out a slow breath, glancing down at the man lying motionless on the ground. He repeated his earlier words, insisting that he was just in the right place at the right time. The officer studied Johnny for a moment, likely suspecting that it wasn't just coincidence. But he didn't press further. He simply nodded and signaled his team to take the criminals away. As the police car pulled away, Lily stood still, watching it disappear down the road. She had finally escaped him. But the scars inside her wouldn't fade so easily. Johnny turned to her, his voice gentle, asking if she was okay. Lily met his gaze. For the first time, there was no fear in her eyes. She assured him that she was fine and thanked him again. They stepped out of the alley back onto the main road. The sky had started shifting to a pale gray, signaling the arrival of a new day. The first light of dawn crept between the buildings, casting a soft glow over Lily's face. A new beginning. She turned to Johnny, hesitating before asking if he had somewhere to go. Johnny chuckled lightly and admitted that he had only been out for a walk, though the night had turned out to be much longer than he had expected. Lily let out a soft, relieved laugh, then said she thought she needed a walk too. And so, they walked together, down streets slowly awakening to morning. For the first time in a long while, Lily felt safe. A few weeks later, Johnny sat in his usual cafe, a steaming cup of black coffee resting before him. He gazed out the window, watching as sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting delicate shadows on the wooden table. Everything seemed to have returned to normal, but something had changed. Johnny reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a letter. Lily had sent it to him. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the delicate handwriting, slightly unsteady, yet filled with sincerity. Johnny, you may not realize it, but you changed my life forever. I'm not just grateful that you saved me from him. I'm grateful that you helped me believe I was worth saving. Thank you, Johnny. I'm starting over. A new job, a new home, a life no longer haunted by fear. I don't know how I could ever repay you, but I hope that one day I can help someone the way you helped me. Lily. Johnny smiled. There were no news articles about what had happened. No one hailed him as a hero, but he didn't need that. Just knowing that someone had a chance at a better life, that was enough. He folded the letter, tucking it carefully back into his pocket. Then he lifted his cup, took a slow sip, and let the moment settle. One night, one person, and that was all that mattered. The lesson from this story is simple yet profound. Not everyone needs a grand hero. Sometimes all they need is someone willing to listen. Someone who doesn't turn away when they see someone in need. Lily never expected to be saved. She had grown used to running, to living in fear, but a single gentle question from Johnny, "Are you okay?" changed everything. Just one moment, a simple act of kindness, can save someone in ways we can't even imagine. There are moments in life when people can't stand on their own. Some wounds don't heal with time alone. Some fears are too overwhelming to face without help. Lily was strong, but even the strongest people have moments of weakness. The question is, when that moment comes, will there be someone willing to reach out a hand? Johnny didn't have to help her. He could have simply sat there, finished his coffee, and walked away as if nothing had happened. But he chose to act. He wasn't a hero, nor did he seek recognition. He simply did what was right, and because of that, a life was changed. Courage isn't always found in great battles. Sometimes it's found in the smallest moments. In the moment Lily chose to trust Johnny, in the moment she found the strength to speak her truth and stop running. That was when she truly took back control of her life. There are people trapped in darkness, waiting for someone to help them see the light. Sometimes we can be that light. Johnny didn't change the world, but he changed Lily's world. And to her, that meant everything. We can't save everyone, but if we can save just one person, the world will already be a different place.